welcome to our weekly Dial Global virtual workshop. Thrilled that you're all joining us today, and even more thrilled that we have such a fantastic speaker and diversity and inclusion practitioner lined up to talk to you all today. Her name is Ashanti Bentil Dhue, which is a lovely name, as well, I must say, first and foremost. She's an equity and inclusion expert. She wears multiple different hats, including having recently written a white paper with some excellent recommendations around race and ethnicity that we're going to be hearing about today. She also helps support the global events industry when it comes to being more diverse, more inclusive, and also looking to support allyship, allies, because we know they're so incredibly important to driving further the agenda. And she's also a real champion of many anti-racist movements. I'm very keen as well to find out a little bit more about Ashanti's #WhiteWomen project, which was the UK's first nationwide anti-racism and allyship project for white women, which I think is an excellent initiative. So can't wait to hear more about that. And without further ado, Ashanti, many welcomes from all of us here, and it's a pleasure to have you, and really looking forward to obviously hearing the presentation that you have for us today around the future for BAME employees and the benefits, most importantly, to wider society, wider business, and further developed communities.
Thank you, Layla, and thank you to the Dial Global team for having me. So this afternoon, I'm going to be sharing some of the findings from the white paper. So we carried out some very extensive research on the experience of millennial and Generation Z Black women working in the UK. And of course, a lot of that content includes recommendations that impact really what is classified as BAME employees within the corporate structure. And today, what I would like to talk to you about is the future and provide some very tangible action points that you can take forward internally to be able to move the needle when it comes to meeting certain requirements, some of which I'll mention that the government are bringing in, and also actually just changing the overall culture, making the culture of your organization much more inclusive, productive, and therefore profitable. So first of all, I like to set the scene and provide some context for some of this, because it's really important at a time like now that we're currently living in. At the moment, with everybody working remotely and working at home, social media has become our workplace. So conversations that may have been had in the lift, in the queue at Starbucks, in the breakout area, are now merging with conversations that we might have at our desk, because we're all using online networking and social media. So I wanted to set the context with some facts. So overall, Black people hold just 1.5%, as you can see, of 3.7 million leadership positions. That figure hasn't really changed since 2014. So we see very little change, okay, when we look at the overall structure and makeup of organizations. And there are some key studies that I would refer you to. The Fawcett Society did a Sex and Power report in January of this year. No CEOs are women of color. 1% of power positions go to women of color, okay? And so that means for Black women specifically, they actually don't have a percentage. So underrepresentation in terms of the BAME group is quite consistent and persistent across all sectors. So this report, if you go and have a look at it, covered all of the sectors that exist in the UK. Really interesting statistics in that report. The backdrop to this is that there are impending deadlines requiring FTSE 100 companies, FTSE 250, to start making sure that they've appointed at least one non-white board member. Okay, so that lets you know, okay, the direction that we're moving in addition to the fact that we have gender pay gap reporting happening and ethnicity pay gap reporting that is about to become mandatory. So all of those things collide together to tell you that there's a real push and pull happening, whereby we need corporations, we need businesses to start working on the culture within their organization so they can start changing these statistics in 10 years, 15 years time. And hearing 10 years might seem quite scary for some of us. In fact, one of the reports that is happening right now in the world, they've estimated it will take 208 years to close some of these gaps. And that's quite a long time when you think about it. So one of the most recent reports that I also wanted to draw your attention to is the Ethnicity and Economic Impact of COVID-19 Report. That came out in March 2020. And there are some key things that they mentioned. Now, one of the things I will say is there aren't really any new recommendations. Okay, when you look at all the reports and studies that have happened over the last 10 years, particularly, the recommendations tend to be more about whereabouts the same. And that tells us that now we need to do some action. Okay, but what I will share with you is that the key points were that policy decisions. So if you're in a situation right now where you're thinking, what can we do, okay, to change some of these figures? Policy decisions must be thoroughly impact assessed. And here's where we get into talking about the difference between intent and impact. Because a lot of the time we may say we didn't mean for these to be the outcomes. But what we have to start looking at as organizations when we come up with policies and initiatives is the impact from the start, okay? And the way we can really explore the impact is making sure that employees who have that lived experience are present and a part of the consultation process, okay? And also making sure that we have representation at policy making and decision making tables. This is really, really important. And this reduces the incidence of unintended negative consequences. And I just thought this was really interesting that this report came in at the start of COVID, okay? Because we know that decisions are being made right now. And, Layla mentioned opportunity, and here it is. 24 billion can be added to, can boost the UK economy. And this report is actually quite old, once again, that this stat has come from. So there's a massive opportunity if you can engage and retain, okay, your BAME employee group. And when you think about the fact that by 2024, 75% of that workforce will be millennial, and in certain cities in the country, they are mostly in this BAME group, which I find very interesting, right? So that direct correlation between how you can boost productivity, profitability in your organization, in the UK labour market as a whole, and investing in this particular group. So let's go on to talk about some key things that we can do. We have to change the DNA of our businesses, okay? We can no longer do external facing work. Very recently, companies have fallen foul of, public perception because they've been posting publicly on social media. Well, is that a requirement? The answer to that is no, okay? What we need to be focusing on internally is the DNA of our business. We need to be demonstrating that we are working on diversity and inclusion. It's non-negotiable and it requires action, okay? And one of the things I always say is that we need to treat it as a business performance metric. This is no longer a charitable endeavor. It's not corporate social responsibility. It very much is and has to be an integral business performance metric. And the board, who we will go on to talk about later, should expect results from those stakeholders that they have made accountable for some of these things, okay? So there has to be targets and there has to be expectations. If you think about it, by 2021, the deadline was set that each board had a non-white board member. Now we're halfway through 2020. How are we doing? Okay, so this is why changing the DNA of your business is really important, but it's not easy. That's one thing for sure. And this is what I mean about that we need to radically change how we approach this. We need to view the BAME employee cohort as an underutilized resource, not a problem to be solved. Okay, so this is a resource that you have that if you invested in, make your business even more productive and profitable. Okay, rather than a problem that needs to be solved. And that's the radical change that we need to have. When Layla mentioned earlier the kind of nationwide 100 White Women project, that is about changing the majority. That is about recognizing some of the privileges and the sphere of influence that white women have in middle management. And if you're interested in that study, I can share that study with you. Okay, we'll go on to see that 83% of HR stakeholders, they're white and they're female. So there's a real power of, there's an influence that they have. How do we tap into that group? Okay, and how do we help them affect greater change? And these are stakeholders you already have. These are stakeholders you've already invested in. So actually, it makes sense. Okay, you've got to utilize that existing resource to get change in other ways. So various studies show, such as these two, I mean, the studies were too many to list, essentially, but it does show that you have to start by challenging the status quo. And the real movement that you see is when you have, chairs, CEOs, industry leaders challenging that status quo. That's what we need. When we talked earlier about the DNA of your business, the parts that are non-negotiable, this is one of them now. It has to come from top down. And there are some reasons that I will share with you in a moment, because studies have shown where the discord is, where we get fractured kind of workplace culture. And often that is because from the top down, there's not expectation, there's not accountability for this particular, what should be a business performance metric. Okay, so we need leaders, we need CEOs, we need boards to really take accountability of this, to be involved in the target setting and actually expect results. So here are some findings that I wanted to share with you that came specifically out of the study that we have conducted. Broad, homogenous approaches to workplace culture, anti-racism and allyship are ineffective. Now, one thing I will say is that, this is probably the first year that anybody's seen anti-racism in the as an actual training on this scale in the corporate environment. You're probably thinking, one of the terms you probably recognize is unconscious bias, right? So that was the kind of buzz training all over the world when it came to D&I practitioners. It's moved now, for good reason, into anti-racism training. This is where you're going to see the most benefit. If you are brave enough as leaders, you're brave enough to pioneer this kind of training internally, where, the status quo is being challenged. The status quo is being challenged. And, we looked at all the things that are being done in the top companies and why they haven't worked. Things like unconscious bias training. Okay, and the fact is that current gender diversity initiatives, which, let's face it, in some sectors is still a little bit behind, we acknowledge that, but you cannot just copy and paste gender diversity initiatives to be able to achieve difference when it comes to investing in the BAME employee cohorts. It's not appropriate because it doesn't address the specific needs of this particular group. And also, for example, if you then start to look at things like intersectionality, so if you look at how gender and race, sexuality, disability, how one person can occupy all of those identities, it makes it a real challenge to copy and paste initiatives, right? So this is why we can see across all of the big companies, the work that they were doing, they've invested money in over a period of years, the ineffectiveness really came down to broad, homogenous approaches. Okay, colorless diversity doesn't work. Okay, so we really need to move towards conscious inclusion, direct intervention, and supported accountability. And I'm going to give some examples of those three things in a moment. Okay, so the main findings are conscious inclusion. So when we talk about, we didn't mean for these to be the outcomes, or we say unconscious bias, we need to move now into conscious inclusion. Direct intervention, okay, so this means that we can no longer leave the results in the hands of network leads or ERGs solely. Okay, we have to have some more intervention in this overall culture change. And then, of course, look, we can all say, here are the findings, here's what you should do, but how do we support you in making those changes? Layla?
Mm-hmm. So I just thought a good segue into a couple of questions that we had from individuals
Sure.
who are watching on demand. So first of all, thank you very much for sharing what you have so far. It's very insightful and gives a real good broad brush overview of some of the astronomical figures there.
Yes.
I mean, another one you
Yes.
mentioned, there's so many different reviews and such like, and data and metrics. Sir John Parker review was assessing specifically race and ethnicity, and it moved 0.6%. And we're
Yes.
looking a lot at the C-suite there, which is really, whilst the needle's moving in the right direction, it isn't something that we should necessarily be celebrating. We're hearing it more and more and more now, diversity and inclusion initiatives, in particular those around race and ethnicity, if they are not addressed at CEO level or C-suite level, it doesn't filter down. Yes, there's no one silver bullet, and we can't look at this just being a one-way arrow. It's mile wide, it's mile deep, but at the end of the day, there's no one silver bullet, but it's not going to be as effective unless it is driven from the top. So some very, very good points there indeed. But some of the questions that we had which came in were specifically around concern over being vilified for saying the wrong thing. For those that wanted to and want to be supportive allies, but are unable to speak what they truly feel, which does come from a good place, but worrying about terminology, because as we've seen a lot in the media, a lot of people are rejecting the terminology BAME, and I know that you and I had this conversation earlier this week, and we were saying, well, BAME, it covers a whole plethora of different things. I would identify as BAME as you would, yet we're both completely, from very, very different backgrounds. So wondered your thoughts around the BAME terminology, and also any thoughts for those that are concerned over being vilified because they're worried about what the right things to say are.
Yeah. And so, do you know what, those are brilliant questions. And this, the one about being vilified goes back to the point I made earlier, which was that at the moment, our desks have converged with break time conversation. Because actually, I think under usual circumstances, if COVID didn't exist, there would be things that we wouldn't say online, and therefore people wouldn't be able to scrutinize them, essentially. I think, the important thing to remember here is the reason why we've got into this place with all of the studies and research that exist and no change is because the internal work hasn't been done. And so I actually have been saying to, any of my peers and clients, don't worry about speaking out loud on social media, because actually the real work needs to be done inside of your organization. And I personally think that it's important to take a step back, reflect, consult internally, so that when you do make a statement, if you choose to make one in an appropriate place, that could be on your website, etc., it is one that is considered, it's a structured response, it is a transparent response, and it is a response that acknowledges maybe that there are areas you need to work on. The best responses I've seen from organizations have been the ones that put a statement out on their site. Maybe they put it on the intranet, they did an internal employee, but it was a measured, transparent response, not kind of knee-jerk, activist type responses on social media. I think it's more appropriate. Look, when you think about any broken relationship, whether you were aware of how broken it was or not, usually if you're trying to heal and breach that, you just have to be very transparent and acknowledge, and with a view to healing. Denial and all of those things usually don't help to heal real human relationships. And I think it's the same in this instance as well.
It's a very good point. And one of the questions before we move on is around CEOs and leaders speaking out. What are your thoughts around this? Because, and I don't know whether you saw the video that we put out yesterday around Black Lives Still Matter, and a number of leaders within the network chose to give a short video. We had a number of CEOs in there who were giving a personal statement. Now, of course, I think the worry is from some CEOs perhaps is, well, what if we say the wrong thing? Is it better, one of our members asked, to really push for CEOs and C-suite to speak out, or is it better for them to remain silent if they're not sure what to say? Now,
again, I don't think there are any hard and fast rules. I think whenever you speak out, as long as you are transparent, you'll be fine. It's okay to actually say, do you know what? we are trying to clean house. We're trying to get our ducks in a row. We're aware that this is a wider issue. We're aware of the role we can play in this issue. Now, a statement along those lines can't really be scrutinized because it is very real, it's human, it's transparent. I think where the issues set in is when CEOs are making comments where maybe they haven't done the fact checking internally first. And so what we've seen, for example, is in these anonymous threads appear of existing and past employees almost whistleblowing. And so then it looks like there's some kind of, mismatch happening here. So I think there's a fact checking part that needs to be done. And then if you do choose to speak out publicly, you need to be aware of what you found internally so that your messaging aligns with that.
Yeah. That's a very good answer. Thank you for that, Ashanti. And I think you're absolutely right, in terms of concurring with you, that really no person, no human being, no organization is perfect. So the honesty and the integrity is the key piece here, and that the well-meaning and the heart is in the right place, because no one is going to get it perfect, and no one's diversity and inclusion strategy is perfect. We're all on this ever-evolving journey. There's always going to be segments that are up, segments that are down.
Exactly.
But it's like saying, to your point on talking about relationships, and I love referring to things in this manner, it's like a marriage. You don't get married and say, right, it's perfect now forever. You're always working on that because it means something. It's a living, breathing, sleeping thing that constantly needs momentum driving behind it.
It really does. And I think also one thing I will say is that for the CEOs who haven't said anything internally, there's a lot of attention on whether they said something publicly. The priority is, what is the feeling inside? We've been contacted by a lot of even senior Black employees who aren't in a position to speak out. So of course, Layla, they consume a lot of our content, and they will message directly and say, thank you for speaking out about this. Thank you for mentioning this. They're still not in positions. And actually, overwhelmingly, a lot of them have said nothing has been said internally. So on that point of healing relationships, on that point of being aware of where we're at and what we need to do to move forward, I think more attention probably needs to be, on what is happening internally. Have you spoken to your employees? And by that, I don't mean, literally calling the one Black employee you've got. What I mean is internally, is this conversation happening holistically? Has there been a recognition of the impact of what's happening and how your company is going to ensure that the culture internally is healthful for your BAME employees? That, I think, should be the priority rather than public social media messaging.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And we've seen a number of great case studies where open forums have partaken, emotional conversations where exec leadership teams have joined in. They've opened the floor globally to say, right, we're going to share stories now, and some brave individuals have stepped up and talked about it. And what you found then is a huge amount of ripple effect goes through the organization, and people really feel engaged, feel like they belong. To ignore it is arguably ignoring those that exist within the business who are obviously deeply affected by the recent events.
Absolutely. And if you think about it as well, one of the things I found interesting is that we had COVID, then we had Mental Health Awareness Week, and then we had George Floyd. And what I find interesting, if you think about the way mental health and even things like menopause are now discussed within the workplace. Now, yes, it's taken time for those things to find their place in the corporate setting and for organizations to invest in well-being, welfare for employees. But something as critical as the socio-economic identity of groups of your employees is something that similarly needs investment and attention. It is a bit bizarre if there's yoga classes on offer, but there's no willingness to have a conversation about race and the fact that maybe the majority, for example, of your BAME employees are in entry roles. It's when you start looking at it in that light, mental health has come along and leapfrogged ethnicity in terms of corporate investment, and we need to look at that. Some of the studies that we looked at did show that when HR professionals completed the survey, they acknowledged the fact that race is a very difficult thing to talk about. Layla, I'll move on to some slides that kind of demonstrate that. We talked about broad brushes. So there's this disconnect that exists between the network leads, the HR stakeholders, the internal D&I practitioners, and then the board, right? People are on different places. But one thing, because they're in different places, there was no ownership or accountability of this issue, which is why sometimes it's difficult to track the progress. But also it was acknowledged that race was deprioritized as a conversation because of how challenging it can be. So other agendas like well-being, like even gender, have received some more investment and attention because it's deemed to be easier to get buy-in at executive level to talk about those issues. Okay, and so one of our big findings was that there's a lack of training with senior leaders and the board and stakeholders, so all of these people in this group, about the actual landscape. So there's a perception gap. You know, a lot of times we think we know what people are experiencing, we think we understand, but there's actually a perception gap there that needs to be closed through direct targeted training for these particular stakeholders within organizations. I mentioned earlier about unconscious bias training isn't enough. We need to move into that anti-racism stage and the allyship stage. We need supported accountability. So this is that stat. So, you know, when you think about 38%, only 38% feel that their employer is comfortable talking about race. That's pretty huge. It's pretty huge. It's something that does need to be talked about. And so one of the things that we recommend are safe space conversations. They need to be facilitated, they need to be structured, they need to be guided, they need to be discreet, particularly for senior leadership and the board. And, you know, this again speaks to this point about social media becoming everyone's workplace at the moment, okay? You know, ordinarily, hopefully these conversations would have taken place within some walls and some structure. Unfortunately, at the moment, people are literally just sharing their thoughts online, which is problematic, even on platforms that are meant to be professional. And I think what happens then is that, you know, words are taken out of context. You can't tell meaning, what someone's intention was. And so we always recommend that separate conversations happen, because as a senior team, you want to get your ducks in a row, explore your own thoughts, ideas, and beliefs, because let's be honest, you may be a senior, you know, at a senior level. That doesn't mean that you have the breadth and the range of understanding when it comes to anti-racism. And so there's a lot of humility that is required as well during these conversations. And so that's a process, a bit like therapy. And so for that reason, we recommend safe space conversations that are separate for senior leaders. Okay, and then when they've got their ducks in a row, or at least they've decided on a united approach, then you can start opening up conversations amongst the kind of employee cohort that you have, because then they feel supported. Okay, there's a difference there. And so it's really important to make sure these are facilitated and structured. And that's why it's also important to invest in experts that can help facilitate these conversations. When we talked earlier about those reports that have talked about, you know, negative groupthink decision making, if you're in a corporate environment where you never understood the problem, or maybe didn't acknowledge the problem, you weren't working on the problem, it is counterintuitive then to create committees and working groups out of the same people. Right, that's not going to get you any different results, because all of those people are on their own journeys of understanding and enlightenment. So it's really important that you engage expert help in conducting these kind of conversations. And it also allows for, you know, the heat is off of you. You can use these external experts to be able to buffer, you know, the dynamics that arise, the emotions that inevitably pour out when these conversations are started. And this is something that as well I thought was prudent to mention. All of the surveying really revealed that whilst these network groups, these ERG groups, etc., are so important, this is an invisible burden sometimes on those employees. They're being paid to do a certain job. And ironically, in other contexts, we talk about them not necessarily reaching out for promotion, or there not being any foundation for them to reach out for a promotion. So you can imagine how difficult it might be to run the black group of XXX in your workplace and then try to do your day job, right? So one of the things we try to look at is just appropriate weighting of responsibilities for pushing forward these agendas and initiatives within the workplace. It shouldn't really fall all the way on the network leads. it needs to again come from the top. But we need to really repair some of the relationships between stakeholders internally so that we can see more progress in this area. And I did mention earlier that 83% of HR stakeholders are white and female. And that stat is important because it just, again, provides context to why this work is so important and why training is needed for HR as well. They're not just meant to be sourcing in training for the employees. They too themselves need to undergo some of this training so they understand the landscape and how their role relates to that landscape as well. And so when you look at all of the big reports and studies and the organizations who have actually moved the needle in this area, there are some key things that they're doing. And one of them is group coaching. Okay, and there's a difference between mentoring and coaching, and there's similarly a difference between mentoring and sponsorship. What we're talking about here is clear, structured investment in the progress of this particular group within your organization, and the results are quite clear. If you combine one-to-one coaching with group coaching, you get up into those 70s, right? And so now you're moving employees along that path to being able to be promoted internally, which, by the way, is a good idea at times. So, you want to be, remember we talked about this being an underutilized group of people, okay? So instead of thinking of them as a problem, it's how do we utilize, how do we invest in this group so that we can be more productive and more profitable? So that's one of the things we see the companies who've moved the needle in this area doing, is investing in the development, the talent development of this particular group. And I know sometimes there's often a conversation about, well, what about everybody else? The thing is that this group does need to be invested in. There's no way of getting out of that. It's very difficult for us as practitioners to make that sound any different, to be fair. This group has to be invested in if we want to see the changes, and there is an expectation, as we say, with these impending deadlines and public reporting, that this happens. And also, what I always say is this radical change in view of how we train in the workplace in terms of workplace culture. If you're doing the anti-racism and the allyship training, you are investing in the whole workforce. Okay, studies show when you invest in this particular cohort who have been, often marginalized systematically over many years within the workplace structure, everybody else benefits. So this is an investment in the overall workplace, not just this particular group of people. So we really need to change our mindset so that we can approach this in the manner in which it needs to be approached to see the results that we're looking for. And I really, honestly, these is a really interesting area that is emerging, that we really looked at when we came up with the results for this white paper: employee activism. Okay, what we're seeing now from millennials, Generation Z and Alpha, they are holding their employers accountable for the decisions that they make. So for example, you look at climate change, that is something that some generations feel very strongly about. Okay, sustainability. And this particular topic is like no other. When you look at the statistics for the generations who are really participating in the activism that is happening right now and the manner in which they do it, it really does speak to this point about employee activism and generational differences. So not only is there going to be regulatory expectation, but if you look at your workforce in the next 3 to 4 years, 75% of them will similarly feel that organizations should live and show the values that they've got listed on the website, on the conference wall, on coasters, on branding and merchandise. They want to see evidence of that. And actually, we can see that usually what happens, especially in these younger generations, is they just leave. When they don't feel like their employer is living those values or values that they deem to be important, they actually leave within 24 months. So that also is something to consider, as well as the fact that you can save money when it comes to grievance procedures, disciplinary procedures. Working on a healthier, more inclusive workplace culture really does benefit the whole business, and I just wanted to share this last thing because we talk about this is, look, we have to move from industry research, from company data, even though I know when it comes to pay gap data, that's something that is an issue. to looking at the ecosystem within your company. And how do we engage that ecosystem? And then we need to dilute that down to not only individual input, but individual responsibility and accountability. So those are the main findings. Those are the main findings really from our white paper.
Thank you very much indeed, Ashanti. And I think this is the perfect time just to ask for another couple of questions to be answered. We've got a couple here in the chat, and one which I think was perfect segue from what you were just talking about there about engaging employees is one of our members who is a very large management consultancy, has got some great systems in place when it comes to diversity and inclusion holistically. And the particular managing director who's asked this question has looked at some of the data and what they can see, and this is specific for Black male employees and the younger ones that are coming in at the bottom of the pipeline in terms of grassroots. They've done some great things in looking at alternative methods to acquire strong talent from different areas, which is excellent. And I said they've done a great job on that, certainly trying to look at recruitment processes which would have otherwise hindered those from certain universities and whatnot being able to get through the door. So that issue, I'm not saying it's solved, but they have really worked hard on that. But they've got a blocker. After literally about 1.5 to 2 years, they literally drop off and they can't retain, and it's specifically Black male employees. And I wondered whether you had any thoughts at all or recommendations around that to be able to dig deeper, because whilst the data obviously tells a certain amount, and it's that juxtaposition between data and engagement and all of the other things that go within that umbrella, what could they be looking at in order to really drive that specific group?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question. And this is where we got to the point about company data. I think it's about the way we read the data. So for example, can they tell the ages of these individuals? And I think also it's the qualitative work that happens within organizations. So, you know, usually before the exit interview, if there is one, you can look at that employee's history. You know, when was the last appraisal? What were the outcomes of the appraisal? What things were actually recommended that they needed to work on? What were the weak areas? You know, how did they get on with the team? This is where that qualitative work comes when we talk about engaging employees and particular cohorts, because it is too late once they've left. It's actually the experience they're having for the year or two that they're there. And actually looking at that experience will start, I'm very sure, because we've done the studies for Black women, it will start revealing some trends. And it usually lies in workplace culture. So for example, at what point are they coming in? Is there a clear path to progression? What investment is being done in terms of the coaching? Yeah, and there's a difference between mentoring. What we see is that mentoring in itself is not necessarily effective for exploiting underutilized talent. It needs to be structured and guided with a clear pathway that both parties have agreed upon. So I would suggest going back and looking at the qualitative elements of that data that they have. Who are these people? What was their journey from start to the point that they left? Are there particular teams or departments in which these people are leaving from? Right? We start getting into the details. Who are the managers in those teams? What are the career paths within those teams? What was the appraisal process like in those teams? Who is doing the appraisal? Because sometimes we find it might be 1 or 2 managers who are doing the same set of appraisals, right? So there might be some themes in terms of their approach. And that's where you start to see where people are dropping off, essentially. And so too, I think there's those other things that I mentioned about the generational differences. You know, young people, younger people are really voting with their feet when it comes to their career. And so that puts a little bit more weight on the employer to make sure they're meeting those needs. And it usually is around career progression and values as well. So I hope that helps someone. I'd say look at the qualitative element and spirit of that data and look a bit deeper into the actual culture and workplace experience. That often can tell us a lot about why there's this drop-off point before 24 months for BAME groups.
Great answer. Thank you, Ashanti. We've had a whole host of questions here, which are all around talent. So very on theme as a good segue from what we were just talking about. So in fact, actually, firstly, I'll read this one. So Ashanti, Ashanti are so compelling. I think we are. Ashanti is very compelling. I think that means, so does Ashanti feel that along with companies holding their employees accountable for their D&I actions and behaviours, but employees themselves further down the hierarchy should hold their senior employees accountable? In other words, the influence should also be a bottom-up approach, exclamation mark.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think with the awareness that, you know, unfortunately, if you are entry level, people are worried about their job stability, and the other things that, you know, are you know, look, you can have rules and policies in place. That doesn't mean people are following them, and the impact to people's mental health, their overall well-being, when they find themselves in scenarios and situations where they maybe have a manager that isn't totally aware of what allyship really is very difficult, right? So you might decide to raise this as an issue and hold someone accountable, a manager accountable, for not necessarily displaying the right attitudes and behaviors. But then what is the repercussions? And this is where we talk about these safe space, no blame, no shame, no repercussion settings, because it's not that easy for entry level individuals to do that in reality. And again, it's about the company. Have you put an environment, have you created an environment where people really can call each other out in appropriate ways when the values are not being upheld? And quite often, it's not the case. Not for entry level staff anyway.
You're absolutely right on the safe spaces and not having that scattergun approach. I think, you know, I had a couple of individuals who've called up recently saying that they have gone ahead and reached out to certain individuals within the broader BAME community who didn't necessarily want to speak about these matters. And obviously, you know, it's a delicate subject, of course, and it means very different things to very, very different people. And so creating these safe spaces where you're saying, right, for whomever wants to join, Black, white, Asian, whatever, to talk, no holds barred, like you say, no shaming, no blaming, but be open. Those places are absolutely fundamentally important, because you know, how do you harness the power of those who wish to talk about it to then take that outside of the almost protective bubble into the wider organisation? Now, a couple of other questions here with relation to talent attraction, retention, etc. Now, in terms of talent attraction and retention, do you think that race as a facet of diversity needs to be managed differently than others?
Yes, I mean, that's what all the studies show. Yeah, race, we know, has been managed differently. That's the irony of it all, because it's been deprioritized and there's been no investment in it. So the answer to that question is now yes, because it has, without people realizing, that's the whole thing about systemic racism, right? You know, it has been managed differently. It's just that now we're in a place where the majority is realizing, wow, this has been managed differently. And so, yes, the solutions have to be very targeted and specific.
And we've got quite a few anonymous questions here as well. So please don't be shy at all. You know, absolutely not judging here, but appreciate you asking the questions very much so. What are the specific performance metrics that you feel need to be used in order to improve a company's performance in respect to D&I?
Yes. Okay. So here's some broad ones. First of all, is, you know, who are you hiring? So proportionality in terms of, you know, race. Also, where are they being hired? What positions are they being hired into? Okay, like I said, sometimes when we look and, you know, we see companies say, you know, actually we've got a good proportion, but we realize they're all the cleaners, or they're all in hospitality, they're all in catering. I'm afraid that doesn't count. And we've actually just started saying that. I'm sorry, no. You need to be hiring people into material positions. We see that drop-off happen at 24 months, so in that middle management sector and above. And as I say, the government is expecting to have not one non-white, just one non-white board member by 2021, okay, or 2024, depending on where you rank. So that's the first thing. Who are you hiring? What positions are they being hired into? Are you paying them properly? And are they being paid the same as their white counterparts? So that's really interesting. Like, those are just broad metrics. Who's on the committee? Who's on the board? The other things are, you can carry out qualitative surveys and get a feel for how your employees actually feel. You know, when you go through appraisal season, have a look at what the outcomes are for certain groups. And then, as I say, start boiling it down. Is it certain departments? Is it certain teams? What managers are carrying out these appraisals? Yeah, so that will help you come up with metrics that, as I say, when we talked about changing the DNA of your business, it's that stuff. It's the processes and the systems that are in place, because ultimately processes and systems win out. So I'd say broadly, those are the kind of metrics to start looking at.
Yeah, it's very interesting indeed. I mean, obviously with the ethnicity pay gap, and we've asked it in our upcoming review paper, which we were speaking about the other day. And one of the questions is as blunt as, it's a mixture of qualitative and quantitative data, but one of the questions is as blunt as, do you measure your ethnicity pay gap? Is that reported? It's literally, it's a yes, no answer.
And you know what? What's interesting about the question that you just shared there is, are you measuring the gap? So we have accepted there is a gap. There has been a gap, and now we're asking people to measure it. Like, and this is why it's so important to change the DNA, and this is why it will become it will be non-negotiable. We can't continue with being okay with there being a gap in the first place. Essentially, it's really, this is why culture is so important, because that's the only thing that is going to help move the needle on these things. Yeah.
Great question here, actually, which again is around recruitment strategies. What are your thoughts, Ashanti, on organisations having targeted talent recruitment strategies for Black graduates versus organisations supporting young Black people to access quality education? How would you balance these for greatest impact?
Yeah, great question. Look, I actually think the real clinger comes with the Black graduates. Okay, because remember, we talked about getting them into these roles and into middle management and higher. And if you know within your company that, you know, having a degree, for example, is a prerequisite, it's part of the criteria, then go out there absolutely and target that talent. It makes sense, right? Because sometimes, and as you say, it is a fine balance, but, you know, there is a gap though between, you know, someone being able to get to the point to go to university and those who've already gone through it and who could apply, as you said, you know, for one of your members, who they have really targeted people who maybe come from universities that aren't on that traditional preferred list. Go to that source, because there's some great Black talent in university who would qualify for some of these roles. Those are like easy and quick wins, right? So go, definitely, if that talent exists, go find it and find ways that you can bring them into your company.
Excellent. And does Ashanti believe in the research that has surfaced that illustrates that a diverse organisation is more agile in its ability to innovate? For example, a culturally diverse organisation that appreciates employees from other countries can appreciate those countries' cultural differences and therefore capitalise on that.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about the fact that, you know, look at COVID, it has accelerated a lot of industries into really using digital tools. Okay. And so if you think about it now, teams that, you know, are spread across the world are now working super close to each other now, because of the fact that we all have to rely on technology at the moment. And so yes is the answer to that. You know, having people with different ways of living, different mindsets, different backgrounds, that always means when you get them all into one room and you give them a task, they're all going to think about it potentially in a different way and come up with something really interesting that you may not have come up with before. And actually, again, thinking about that question, again, if you look at the majority of the makeup of lots of boards and committees, and then we look at the outcomes that have come out of those boards and committees over the last few years, there's not much change. Why? There hasn't been much change in the board or the committee. So actually mixing it up, there's evidence mixing it up will make a difference to innovation, creativity, and again, those key things, productivity and profitability.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating, actually, and we were having a conversation yesterday with a brilliant individual who was talking very much about diversity and inclusion fueling innovation, and it's it reminds me a little of the question here that has been asked, and really kind of dismantling that groupthink approach, which is very difficult, as you say, because when those within the collective don't think that there is an issue, how do you permeate that clique? How do you do that?
That comes down to, as I say, that is why those particular groups absolutely need anti-racism training and allyship training. It's not something anymore, it's not something anymore that is just for the general employee populace. It's something, and I'm just plugging in my laptop, apologies. It's something that is now required for senior leaders so that they understand the landscape, so they speak the language, and so that they give their buy-in and support for the rest of the organization adopting more, healthy workplace culture. And one of the things I wanted to say, one of the on the point of innovation, if you look at what's happening when it comes to sustainability around the world, and you look at some of the best products that are currently being produced as plastic replacements or alternatives, those innovations are happening in places in the world, where you wouldn't imagine that innovation is coming from at all. Some of the plastic alternatives that are out there that are using natural resources, it's incredible. So that is the power of having diversity in the room. Those innovations are happening in Africa, in Asia, in those places, and they're now starting to be adopted in Western societies. And so clearly, creativity and diversity, those two things matched, can be very, very profitable and productive for businesses.
Absolutely, especially when we look at the customer base. It was interesting. I was speaking to a fantastic market insight organization the other day, and their CEO said that they were looking at a particular insight study, and there was no one on the committee that was from an Afro-Caribbean or a black background, ultimately, and they'd missed one big piece out of it. And of course, it was just simply because there was no one there in the room who would have brought it up. And so, no, it's absolute critical business imperative. Obviously, these are the customers from around the world that we're serving. Now, if anyone else has got any other questions, please do ask them in the chat, because we are coming to the end of time today. We have loads of great questions, lots of anonymous ones actually as well. So thank you all who have asked those. And don't worry, all of this will remain confidential within our community. So please don't worry about asking whatever you want. This is the last chance right now before we thank Ashanti very much. We have got one other quick question here, and I wanted to ask a question actually as well personally, because I thought it'd be beneficial to all. So firstly, another anonymous attendee says, would you advise a different approach to D&I for an SME type organization in comparison to a larger, more corporate one? It's a very interesting question.
It is. I think that really comes down to more to scale, right? As an SME, you are going to recruit at some point, so there are some very healthy practices that you can adopt for recruitment. In terms of workplace culture as well, setting the tone from the top down, even if you're a small business, is still important. And in actual fact, when you're a small business, the fact that people are working in close proximity for a lot of the time with the same people, often there is a need for this type of training. So I would say it's more about scale as opposed to doing different things. It's about thinking about who you have. And there's also another little point that I find quite interesting is if you have a predominantly white workforce, that doesn't mean this training is not needed. In fact, it's even more necessary, because if you're preparing to recruit, you need to make sure there's an inclusive culture to invite those people into. There's no point in just focusing on recruitment, inviting people to work with you, but you haven't really created and nurtured and cultivated inclusive workplaces with your existing people. And the one thing that I find quite interesting is that if you were to survey predominantly white workplaces, not everybody's going to feel the same about how good or not things are. Why? Because we all have identities that we sit in outside of race. And so that tells you the importance of working on inclusive workplace culture in general. regardless of the racial makeup of your organization.
Absolutely. And a quick question, because I know we've only got 4 minutes, but I would just love to hear some of the recommendations and some of the outputs from the 100 White Women project that you did. Because I think, you know, look, anyone that is passionate about diversity and inclusion in whatever guise that might be, fantastic. I take my hat off to you, because this is about the wider business, wider community, our future generations of leaders more holistically at the end of the day. But when we look deeper into that inclusivity spectrum, or if we were talking about the kind of the various different facets under that holistic dial, well, actually, you know, the gender diversity piece is far more accelerated than many of the other pieces. And by gender diversity, I mean male, female, because I think we have still got a fair bit of work to do when it comes to non-binary. I'd love you to share some of the insights and maybe some of the recommendations that came out from that 100 White Women project. It's the only one done in the UK, and I think, wow, what a phenomenal thing to get all those people together and get people talking, because it's diversities within diversities. And I'm convinced that the future is niches within niches within niches. You know, it is key that we understand diversity and inclusion isn't just one pillar topic, you know?
I love that. Thanks, Leila. And you know what, you literally shared the backdrop to this, right? So you think 83% of HR stakeholders are white and female. When you look at middle management, there is a plethora of white females, okay? And when you look at gender diversity as an initiative within most businesses, there is still that fight to get women into more senior positions and boardrooms. But here is where there could be some incredible results. What if all of those women in the middle understood allyship? Because what that would mean is the people that they manage would have a much better work experience. It means that they would turn up or show up at work in healthier ways for their peers. But it also means that on their way up, they would be aware of the challenges that the BAME employees are experiencing. And what that means is when they're in those boardrooms and these policies are coming across the table, they now have an opportunity to influence how that policy is even implemented, because they understand anti-racism, they understand allyship. And that's how I identified that this was a powerful group. So instead of, vilifying them, what if we got them to be reflective? What if we got them to harness and understand that privilege that they have, that they're in those positions anyway? What if we got them to think, how can I turn this privilege into power? It would cascade upwards and downwards. So that was really the concept behind 100 White Women. And the idea is that we get 100 white women in every city in the UK, which is rather ambitious, but I think it would make a real difference to most people's workplace experience.
Great answer. Phenomenal initiative. Honestly, I take my hat off to you for that. And I think privilege, which we could do another whole webinar around that. But privilege is still a very uncomfortable subject for many people to be talking about. I've spoken to a number of great CEOs who are quite happy to talk about privilege, and they recognise that. And I think many others perhaps are embarrassed about it. I mean, I think we all enjoy certain levels of privilege. I certainly do.
I'm able-bodied, for example. I recognise that I'm able-bodied. So there's lots of privileges that I have. So how do we take the stigma away from privilege is what we're trying to achieve with 100 White Women. How do we get you to understand the power that's in that privilege? So instead of being deflated or defensive or uncertain, how do you use that power now to not only help your peers, but help the people that you manage? And that's allyship.
Couldn't agree more. It's moving so much further away from the concern over the, like you say, being defensive of the haves and the have-nots. Well, it wasn't my fault that, it wasn't my fault that. No one said that it would, but use that for the wider community and the wider benefit, because you have power, and it doesn't mean that you're not a fantastic person at the same time.
Let's reframe it. Let's take a radical relook at the way we're having these conversations in the workplace. And so that's why I said, if you've got a predominantly white workforce, this work needs to be done, because there's power in that workforce that, again, is underutilized.
Ashanti, thank you so much for being here with us today.
No, thanks for having me.
Loads and loads of questions, so thank you all of you who attended today.